You're watching Newsfeed AM. It is the special broadcast this weekend. Following 2 days of legal arguments, the panel of judges at the International Court of Justice must now decide whether it will issue a preliminary order for Israel to stop its onslaught in Gaza immediately before ruling on whether Israel did violate the 1948 Convention against Genocide. Now, the proceedings were broadcast live by media houses in the Middle East and including the entire African continent, while Western media houses prioritized arguments presented by Israel. So, what is the foreign policy and indeed domestic motivations for attempting to hold Israel accountable on an international stage? And what are the geopolitical consequences of what we observed this week? Joining me to discuss this is Professor Ylva Rodney-Gumede. She's with me in studio. She is head of Internationalisation at the University of Johannesburg. We're also joined by Professor Chris Landsberg, and she is the chair of African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. All right, to both of you, thank you very much for your time. Let me start in studio here. Professor Gumede, let's begin with you, and in particular the focus has to do with how the media covered this particular case. What were your thoughts as you watched domestically, hoping that you also would have seen international media, how they treated this story?
I think it's really interesting, and I'll come back to that later as well, what we can learn out of the coverage of the court in particular, the court case in particular. But I think that we need to take a step back and look at how this conflict or the war on Gaza has been covered more generally. We have to remember that very few media houses and very few journalists have had direct access to the conflict.
Yeah.
The Gaza and Palestine and the Palestinian territories are completely closed off to not only international organizations but also to the media. So the media that has come out of the coverage that has been on the ground has been by Palestinian and Palestinians themselves, Palestinian media houses and Palestinians themselves, who have had direct access, who have also been the direct victims of the war on Gaza, which puts a particular spin on the coverage, of course.
Yeah.
But coming back then to the court case, I think that it's been interesting, as you say. I think that it's a very censor-filled, a very emotional environment. People have taken very strong views on the war. We have seen direct kind of pro-Israeli kind of factions in siding almost with the Israeli state and the war on Gaza, and also, of course, the opposite side as well. And, of course, I mean, as journalists, we are accustomed to, particularly those of us who have covered war and conflict, to covering the unthinkable, things that shouldn't ever have to be covered, if you get what I'm trying to say.
Indeed.
But I think that, and this is such a situation. How can you ever try to justify what's happening? How can you ever try to understand? And yet you have to do that as a journalist. And I think that in the main, the coverage have tried to do so without having direct access.
Let's bring in Professor Chris Landsberg. Prof, thank you for your time as well. Before we get into the merits of what was listened to by the judges at the International Court of Justice, can I give you the opportunity to weigh in on the media reportage of this case? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, so let me piggyback onto my colleague's view, and Professor, by the way, good to see you. I still work for UJ, just to let you know. I just want to latch on to what you say, but come at it from a different angle. Isn't it interesting, colleague, that the one moment we were seized with Ukraine and Russia, and it's almost like it might not have disappeared, but it all of a sudden played second fiddle to the 3-month-old war playing its out, grotesque war, I should say, playing itself out in Gaza by Israel, ostensibly in reaction to what happened on the 7th. The events of the 7th, which I am not scared to call an act of terror, enjoyed unprecedented coverage. But I remember saying to a colleague, Prof, what is to come will make what happened on the 7th of October with the attack by Hamas on the kibbutz look like a walk in the park. So Western media, world media in general, but Western media focused on that. But here is the main point briefly I want to make, colleague. I do a lot of channel hopping because of my job. I have to.
Yeah.
And by the way, it includes Newzroom Afrika. But if I can just draw a contrast for you. When I look at Al Jazeera, and incidentally Al Jazeera suffered more journalistic and journalist casualties than CNN. I'm not aware that CNN or Sky lost one journalist in this war. Throughout the 3-month war, more journalists died than during any other war prior to this. And that gives for me the sense of the coverage. Al Jazeera was unadulterated. It was crude. It was in your face. It showed these horrific images. And I have to say this, and ready for the reaction. CNN journalists literally sit in the tankers of Israeli armed forces as they go and do these raids, bombings, and the like. So if we think there is equity and parity, here, no. So I conclude with this notion, there has been what William Mpofu so eloquently called weapons of mass deception going on. There's been a propaganda war that's been going on, including and led by media houses.
Very interesting indeed. Professor Gumede, let's come back to you, because what we then subsequently saw this week being presented before the ICJ was South Africa's case accusing Israel of genocide. If we use the prism of the media coverage, we've already spoken about journalists in Palestine who have been casualties of this war. And to some extent, if you watch the one channel that is on the ground, Al Jazeera, many of their journalists dying, but also their family members, they were saying that they have been targeted. Now you bring in the element of what Professor Landsberg is talking about, where some journalists from international broadcasters are embedded with the Israeli army. The case that was argued there, would that have a bearing on this case of genocide in terms of how the media is treating the story?
You know, I think it's a good question. I think that what we've seen, as Prof Landsberg also set out earlier, is this idea then that it's a very polarized media space, and I alluded to that as well. And sort of, you know, this embeddedness, as you say, of some journalists then. And we can talk about an embeddedness in a different way as well, that when, as you say, we've seen journalists being killed, their family members being killed. We've seen journalists having to cover shootings and maiming of their own family members, which has been absolutely heart-wrenching too, and of course amidst all the other things. But I think that this is why the court case also has been so important for the media. I'm not saying that there's an element of theatre around a court case as well, where we need to see beyond the actual arguments presented. But the idea of covering a court case and court reporting is so essential to journalism and to the training of journalists, because you have these two sides that presents argument that you can then, as a journalist, present to your audience with some kind of other, additional commentary on from the legal counsels as well as from your own contextual understanding of what goes on outside of the court.
Can I quickly come in there and ask a very direct question? Given the world's attention of what has been going on in the Middle East, do you think it was incumbent upon every broadcaster to take this case live as opposed to the criticism, and I'm not afraid to actually mention them, as opposed to the criticism that we then saw when Israel put its case, that Sky News decided that they were going to take some of that live broadcast, whereas when South Africa presented its case, there was no live broadcast of that particular case. I can't speak for CNN or BBC. I did exactly what the Prof was saying, channel hopping, and I honestly didn't see it.
I think we all tried to follow and see what was happening in the broader media scape as journalists, and of course we are interested in seeing how it's being covered. I think it's also very, I noticed also how cursory it was treated by some of the Western media, for example. And I think that, of course, for South African media, we were directly, involved, and there are stakeholders that have a direct stake in the case. I would argue, as a world community, we have a stake in this case. It will set precedent, whichever way the ruling goes from the court, it will set a precedent for international humanitarian law. So, we do have a vested interest in it, and particularly then countries that are signatories to the International Court of Justice, of course. So the ICJ signatories have a direct kind of interest in the case. So it should have been covered in full. It's very easy to take things out of context. If you would have covered a court case in full, you would have gotten a better insight into the war on Gaza than you would have from much of the media coverage that we have seen in the last 3 months. So I think that this is something that's also really important to remember. But coming back to what you say, I think that yes, we have an obligation to cover the court case, absolutely, in full.
Professor Gumede, Professor Chris Landsberg, can I ask you to just remain exactly where you are? We're going to take a break. When we return, we then try and get to grips with the merits of the case that was put before the International Court of Justice in a bit. If you're just joining us, a very good morning to you, and you find us in the middle of a conversation with Professors Ylva Rodney-Gumede. She is head of Internationalisation at the University of Johannesburg. We also have Professor Chris Landsberg, the South African Research Chair of African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Prof Landsberg, let's come to you. And can we then tackle what I suspect is a priority for South Africa when it put its case before the ICJ, and that is to ask that court to urgently deal with the matter of a ceasefire. Do you think the merits of that argument were put strongly by South Africa? And of course, you can juxtapose that with the response by Israel.
Sure. Just allow me a few seconds just to say something about the important question you asked, Prof Gumede, Ylva Gumede. You asked the question, did we notice Sky News, or for that matter CNN? CNN spent a lot of time on the Israeli one. Look, let's also be fair. Because South Africa is almost the party that took the case to the ICJ, it's not surprising that we spend so much time. If it was another African country, would we have done the same? Well, the jury's out there. What I do want to say, though, and this is the key point, let's make peace with the idea that in this world, and a world in which the West are fighting tooth and nail to maintain their hegemony and the remnants of the Western liberal order, embedded journalism is a tool that have been used before Iraq, since Iraq, and will continue like that. I'm not in the least surprised. But let's come to your point and link it to this question of coverage. South Africa's reputation, at least on this issue, its gravitas, its standing in the world, has grown so exponential that nobody saw it coming so quickly, least of all from an African state, to lead the charge on Israel. And the consequences are serious. The consequences are grave, including for South Africa. The backlash will be serious. I don't necessarily think we should celebrate too early, as I've said yesterday, but I have no doubt that in terms of what Ambassador Baronsela did so systematically, the 7 points that they asked for the ICJ to act upon as the preliminary measures on this matter, that some will be found in our favor. I think we were methodical, we were well prepared, we were good. Where I do have two criticisms. The one is, I think when we gave the list from the President Herzog to the Prime Minister, the Hawkish, Benjamin Netanyahu, and everybody, and the actions of the soldiers on the ground when they go and destroy the water infrastructure, the medical infrastructure, I think we should have made those links and almost prove that the one led to the other. I think there was an assumption that we just stated out there. I'm not surprised that Israel based its response on only 4 things. First of all, jurisdiction, when they tried to counter Professor John Dugard. Secondly, the dispute between Israel and South Africa. How rich for Israel to say there was no dispute. The fact that they said that they responded to South Africa's démarche says there's a dispute. There's a difference between people. So I'm not sure how far they're going to go there. And predictably, the relationship between Hamas and Israel, and above all else, the self-defense of the 7th of October. In short, colleague, to give my colleague an opportunity, I think South Africa should have been much stronger in making the case that yes, there was the 7th, and South Africa condemned it. But before the 7th, there were 136 Palestinians killed during that year. There's been a conflict there for 76 years. And because Israel was so boldly political, which South Africa should have anticipated, I think South Africa could have notched up the politics of its strong legal case a bit more. But South Africa did a sterling job. The world is looking at it. And just this morning, Germany of all countries said they will go out of their way to resist the court if the court finds against Israel and in favor of South Africa. So the European countries are not only becoming divided, they're nailing their colors to the mast.
Yeah. We're going to talk the consequences when we wrap this discussion, because I suspect the Prof is pointing to something there. Professor Gumede, I want to immediately talk about South Africa's relationship, in the words of the Israeli representative at the court, who said that South Africa, it is no secret that it enjoys a particular relationship with Hamas. And why do they make a meal of this? It is that Hamas officially, at least in many countries, is regarded as a terrorist organization. But here's the difference. South Africa, the government, says we have no relationship with Hamas. But that relationship is at party political level. The ANC has hosted Hamas, even after the October 7 attacks. Do you think that that may likely count against South Africa? And why am I asking this question, Prof? It is linked to what Professor Stremlau, whom I interviewed yesterday, said. The politics of the court, the ICJ itself, should not be lost on us, given that that court is headed by a president whose nationality is that of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely, and as we know, the presiding judge of the court is also then has the weighing final vote in case of a tie, so to speak. So that's interesting. But yes, of course, talking about Hamas and talking about the terror events of the 7th, it's highly emotional, and yes, in public opinion it does count. I think when we look deeper into political and governmental relations, we see it differently. We can understand things in a different way. But I also want to point out that actually Israel undermined their own argument there, because they're the ones that says that there's no difference between the Palestinians and Hamas, for example, in justifying the attack on Gaza, and then turn around and say that, you know, South Africa has special relations with Hamas. You know, it's a bit, you know, but anyway, let's not make too much about that. I want to come back to what Professor Landsberg said about, you know, I think it's really interesting. South Africa kept it to the level of absolutely the moral, arguing from the moral vantage point of this has to stop.
Yeah.
You know, genocide can never be defended. What's happening, whatever, by whatever means we would label the war on Gaza, it has to cease, and it has to cease now. So I think that's the thing, and that's why they didn't go into those details. But as Prof Landsberg says, we knew that the details were going to come from then the respondent from Israel's side, in more detail what's happening on the ground. But of course, you're not saying then that actually our military is destroying infrastructure that they then claim to repair. You know, so you know, you can talk endlessly about the details of it, but I think we laid the case out there really well with a strong legal team, and we had a moral obligation to do so.
So let's wrap it up then. Professor Landsberg, I want to then deal with your point that you made, that the consequences of what South Africa has done, which is to take Israel before a court of law to answer on what they say is a violation of the Genocide Convention. This morning, I think this piece was written yesterday, and so this morning on News 24, Quos Gombes writes an opinion piece with the title, "The Stark Contrast Between the ANC's Foreign Policy and its Performance at Home." Basically, he's saying that after 30 years of inept and selfish rule, selfish ANC rule, what is there to be proud of by the ANC? It almost reminds me of a piece that I read at the beginning of this week by Dr. Mpumelelo Mkhabela, who says if South Africa is going to put itself up almost as a paragon of virtue on human rights, how clean is its record domestically? Is that the consequences you're talking about?
I'm not surprised about that narrative. It was only a matter of time that narrative would come. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if analysts like this will go a step further in the days to come and say, with your poor performance of service delivery and the conditions in which many of your people live, that might amount to, quote-unquote, you know, genocide or crimes against humanity. People will say anything. I tell you what's interesting about the point that was made, though. He not only inadvertently, but he openly almost said it was a stellar performance by South Africa, and it was a stellar performance by South Africa. I will just add one thing to what Prof Ylva Rodney-Gumede said. And it wasn't just that South Africa stuck to the moral. is that it stuck to the issue of the legal and genocide. Now, I would have expected South Africa, in spite of the fact that this is confined to genocide and South Africa stuck to the script, that South Africa could have thrown in there things like ethnic cleansing, attempt to wipe out the people. They used examples, the Israelis, of how they would drop leaflets saying move to the east, and just when they move to the east, the bombs are coming. But let's talk about one or two other consequences. Yeah. So I don't want to be confined to somebody that now conveniently compares the domestic and the foreign, or be that on the domestic front we could have done much better. Here are the ramifications. Whatever the court is going to decide on the 6th, and I think it's going to be something of a balance. I'm not sure they will totally go for a ceasefire. If they do, then they really let the cat amongst the pigeons. It's going to the UN Security Council. The United States is most likely to veto it. Then it goes to the General Assembly. What this thing has done, and what South Africa has done by being the first country to be so bold to do what it's done, it is now an issue that you yourself, myself, and many other analysts, including Prof there, debated last year. The schisms in the world, the tensions, the geopolitical fractures that are playing out. This one is going to show the divisions much more, because here is the apex court of the United Nations, and if nothing else, in short, the United States might remain militarily and economically a superpower, but its political and moral legitimacy, together with that of Israel, is waning by the day. What am I saying to you? There was a time when we know who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. What South Africa has done with this act, gone are the days when Anglo-American and Anglo-Saxon countries who thought they held the moral high ground for everybody, that they are untouchable and they would never be dragged before a court of law. South Africa has now opened up that can of worms, and world affairs, and certainly legal world affairs, will not be the same again after this case against the state of Israel, the Zionist state of Israel.
Professor Gumede, I see you agreeing very vehemently there, particularly, I think, on the score of the United States and what I would simplify, as Professor said, as the United States and its constant worry about its public image. If indeed this court does say there is a case of genocide here, how bad is that going to be for the United States?
I don't necessarily want to pronounce on that, because I think it has consequences beyond the United States or any one country. Right. You know, this will set precedent whichever way, you know, the court rules. But I think there's a very important aspect to it. If the court rules in favor of the respondent in Israel, saying that this is not genocide, or, you know, dismisses the case, what we might see, and this is the interesting thing with a court such as the ICJ, that just a few kilometers down the road in The Hague, we have the former tribunal for Yugoslavia, which was the Colosseum that dissected issues and actually then dealt with war crimes and war criminals after the fact that things had happened, when we could no longer stop them. They had already taken place. And we want to avoid sitting with a Palestinian tribunal a few kilometers down the road from the ICJ in the future. We want this to cease now. And I think that's the important aspect of it. And something needs to happen. Otherwise, it will have consequences down the line.
We are almost at the hour of 10 o'clock. Something tells me that we've already exhausted this hour anyway. Can I quickly then turn this on its head? Professor Landsberg, get the first stab at it. And that is, indeed, what South Africa has done is it has put itself on a very, very important moral platform globally. But we have to discuss what it has done and juxtapose it to what is going on the home front. It cannot be lost on us that the governing party, is marking 112 years. That was on Monday, but today is a formal celebrations of that. But second of all, that this year we are going to mark 30 years of democracy. The governance record of the ANC vis-a-vis its human rights case that it has put before the International Court of Justice. How good is a job they have done in the 30 years of government?
I like the point that you end on the 30-year mark, and I'll even go as far as saying that, ironically, especially if the court finds, even in part, in favor of South Africa, that after the election we may ironically have a government and a constellation of a government that will have a debate about what to do with this decision, and some will agree and some won't agree. But without ducking and diving your question in 10 seconds, colleague, all politics is domestic. And I think if the ANC wants to be a paragon abroad, it better starts to be an example at home. And where it was found wanting the most, particularly over the course of the last 15 years, was in the area of governance and turning lofty policy ideas into tangible outcomes for its own people. And there's the contrast. And I might also say to you, I think South Africa made a lot of mistakes in foreign policy, but the turning point came with Ambassador Bikati and Lady R. It's almost there's been a maturing of South Africa's foreign policy that came in the space of 6 months that is unbelievable and breathtaking.
Prof Gumede, you get to have the last word.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. No, I think that, I agree with what Prof Landsberg is saying. I think also importantly, we have seen the lawyers now at the ICJ, the South African team that's gotten the backing from government, from the South African public. I hope that they're going to get the same backing when they take up domestic cases going forward, because these are lawyers that have been fighting for social justice domestically, internationally, and I hope that they will get the backing that they deserve for other cases that are coming as well.
Indeed, and I remember Advocate Adila back in the days of the Marikana massacre. That's
Absolutely.
when I first came across her, and she has stayed on this path for the longest time, and look at where she is now. Well, thank you very much to both of you, Professor Ylva Rodney-Gumede and Professor Chris Landsberg.